Have you ever heard of a city drowning in crime gangs, drugs, robberies, murders, then suddenly, it all disappears? Not a slow drop, not a gradual decline, but a cliff. The crime rate plunges straight down, like a heart attack on a chart. Overnight, criminals vanished from the streets. Neighborhoods once ruled by fear became safe, and the entire nation stopped and stared in shock. Sounds like the opening scene of a movie, right? But what if I told you this wasn't Hollywood? This was real. It happened right here in America. Let me take you back to one morning in Washington, D.C., inside a high-level national security conference. The room was packed with governors, FBI executives, state police chiefs, analysts, every big name you could think of in law enforcement. The atmosphere was tense, thick with caffeine and skepticism. On the massive screen behind me, data charts flashed, crime rates across different states over the last 3 years. Some states were trending up. Some flatlined. A lucky few showed modest declines. But then, in the bottom right corner of the screen, there was one chart that didn't just decline. It collapsed. A bright red line that plunged like someone had taken a knife to the numbers. Almost vertical. Immediately, the whispers started. What happened in State B? Who's behind this? Is it real or cooked numbers? I, David Lynn, the presenter that morning, stood there facing hundreds of eyes. Curious, suspicious, hungry for an answer. I had prepared for this moment, but truthfully, the first time I'd seen that red line myself, I didn't believe it either. It looked less like data and more like a glitch. Sure enough, the first question came. A man in a grey suit raised his hand and said, "Mr. Lynn, can you tell us why crime in State B has dropped almost straight down in just 2 years? What's their secret? Did they stumble upon some miracle technology?" The room buzzed. Dozens of heads nodded. Everyone wanted to know. I smiled. That's the question I was expecting. And yes, I was just as shocked as you when I saw it. That's why I spent 3 months digging into what happened in State B, and my conclusion is this. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a glitch. And it wasn't about fancy budgets or futuristic weapons. It all came down to one man. A man who did what everyone else said was impossible. His name was James Howard, the youngest state police director in America. Now, James wasn't at the conference that day. He rarely attended flashy events. But I knew him very well. Years earlier, we trained together at the National Academy. 2 rookies, hungry to serve. Howard finished near the top of our class. I, as it happened, graduated first. The crowd gave polite applause when I said that, but I didn't linger on it. Because here's the truth. I might have been better in the classroom. But James Howard had something I didn't. Something you can't measure on a test. Something that doesn't show up on an IQ score. He had willpower. Pure, relentless, unshakable will. That willpower became his greatest weapon, while I was still grinding through middle management positions. James Howard's name was making headlines, big arrests, bold operations, fearless leadership, until finally he became state police director at an age nobody thought possible. And now, with State B's jaw-dropping crime stats, he was a legend. But when I finally sat across from him and asked, "James, how did you do it? How did you break the back of crime in State B?" He didn't give me some long-winded speech. He didn't brag. He just looked me in the eye and said one word: willpower. At first, I laughed. I thought he was joking. But then his face didn't change. And he leaned in and explained something that shook me to the core. David, he said, criminals don't win because they're smarter. They win because they're hungrier. Every thief, every gang leader, every drug lord, they're fueled by greed and hate. Those are powerful motivators. They push people past their limits. They make them organize, fight harder, risk everything. That's why the bad guys always seem one step ahead. I sat there stunned, because I'd seen it myself. Criminal networks often had stricter discipline than normal society. Rules enforced with brutal punishment. Loyalty stronger than family bonds. A twisted kind of order. And yes, in a way, their commitment to crime often outmatched the commitment of law-abiding citizens to peace. Then Howard dropped the part that hit me hardest. Now think about the good guys. The cops, the citizens, the average people. They're not fueled by greed. They're not burning with hate. They just want to live, work, raise their kids. Which means, frankly, their motivation isn't as strong. Their willpower doesn't burn as hot. That's why they often fall behind. He paused, then leaned back with that calm, unshakable look of his. So what did we do in State B? We built willpower. We gave our officers the same fire criminals had, but fueled by justice instead of greed. Fueled by loyalty to the community instead of loyalty to a gang. Fueled by love for their country, their neighbors, their families. That's how we flipped the game. Those words didn't feel like theory. They felt like a blueprint, a playbook, and in practice, they worked. I spent months studying his methods. Yes, he pushed for resources, but he also redesigned training. Officers weren't just drilled in procedures, they were trained in resilience, in mental toughness, in psychological endurance. He brought in psychologists, not just to analyze criminals, but to support the officers themselves. He restructured task forces, not stopping at one conviction, but tearing down entire networks, layer by layer. And maybe his boldest move, he extended the fight into the prisons. Even after criminals were sentenced, Howard's people worked with wardens, psychologists, social workers, chipping away at the root of greed, hate, and arrogance until those flames dimmed. It was hard. It was messy. But it worked. And so, when I stood at that conference in Washington and shared the story, the hall fell silent. Then slowly, applause, louder, louder, until the room erupted. Not for me, not for the data, but for the truth. The war on crime isn't about weapons, or money, or technology. It's about willpower. That day, I realized something else too. James Howard's story wasn't just about one state. It wasn't just about crime. It was about us. About human nature itself. About how easily the wicked gain strength from their darkest impulses. And how the good must find their own fire if they ever hope to win. And that is the story I want to share with you. Not about numbers. Not about luck, but about spirit, about iron determination, about one man whose willpower changed everything. When people hear about James Howard today, they imagine a born hero. They picture someone who was destined to lead, destined to win. But the truth, nothing about his early life looked destined. James grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father worked at the steel mill, his mother a school. They didn't have much. Their house was small, their bills were always stacked high on the kitchen counter. And when the steel industry collapsed, his father lost his job. For months, his family barely scraped by. That was the world James grew up in: uncertainty, survival, and the feeling that no one was coming to save you. From an early age, he hated bullies. He hated watching stronger kids push around the weak, and he often got into fights defending others. His teachers called him stubborn. His friends called him reckless. But his father, a quiet man with a hard jaw and worn hands, said one thing that stuck with him for life: "If you're going to stand for something, son, then stand all the way. Halfway won't save anybody." That line burned into James's soul. When he was old enough, while many of his friends drifted into factory work, James chose the police academy. Not because it was glamorous, not because of money, but because he believed, deep in his bones, that protecting people was his purpose. I remember our first day at the National Academy. James wasn't the fastest runner. He wasn't the sharpest on written exams. Honestly, he was in the middle of the pack. But what set him apart was how he refused to quit. I watched him fail obstacle courses, get knocked down in sparring sessions, and still drag himself back up, bleeding and grinning through broken lips. Instructors noticed. They'd tell us, "Howard's not the smartest here, but he's the one who'll still be standing when the rest of you drop." And they were right. One night, during training, we had a brutal endurance test overnight field survival course in freezing rain. Cadets dropped out left and right. By 3 a.m., everyone was shivering, soaked, and begging for shelter. James was shaking like the rest of us, but he kept repeating, almost like a chant, "One more hour, one more mile, one more step." That became his philosophy. Never think about the mountain, just the next step. Years later, when he faced criminals with armies of lawyers, gangs with networks that stretched across cities, he applied the same rule. Don't think about crushing everything at once. Think about the next step, the next fight, the next case. After graduation, we went separate ways. I joined a federal unit. James went straight into one of the toughest precincts in the state, downtown Pittsburgh, back when it was drowning in drugs, gang violence, and corruption. That first year almost broke him. He told me once about a case early in his career. A gang had taken over an entire block. Residents were too scared to testify. Businesses were forced to pay protection money, and even some officers looked the other way. James tried to push back. He made arrests, but every time, witnesses went silent, cases collapsed, and the gang came back stronger. Most rookies would have burned out. But James, he doubled down. He started walking the streets at night, talking to residents, shaking hands with business owners, learning names, listening to their fears. Slowly, painfully, trust formed. One old woman, Mrs. Johnson, finally whispered a name to him. That single clue cracked open the case. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a Hollywood takedown. But brick by brick, James chipped away at the gang until one night the block was free. Kids played outside again. Families sat on porches. And for James, that victory wasn't just about numbers. It was proof. Proof that persistency and will could outlast fear. And that, right there, was the seed of his philosophy. Crime wasn't just about guns and drugs. It was about psychology, about willpower. Criminals had it. Too often, good people didn't. And James Howard swore he would change that balance, no matter how long it took. Of course, not everyone believed in him. Some mocked his obsession with mindset. Others called him naive. But with every case, every fight, his conviction grew. And one day, Years later, when he finally became the youngest state police director in America, that same stubborn will was about to change history. When James Howard was officially appointed chief of police, the whole city was caught off guard. He was still relatively young for the role, and many of his fellow officers whispered behind his back, "A dreamer like him. How long will he last?" The day James walked into his new office, the building itself felt tired. Old walls still carried the smell of stale cigarettes. Paperwork piled up everywhere, and the atmosphere among the force was heavy with apathy. Officers clocked in and out like factory workers, some quietly tied to the underworld, others simply waiting for retirement. And outside, crime ruled the streets. That was the legacy James inherited. In his very first week, James did something no one expected. He didn't arrive in a motorcade, didn't lock himself behind layers of security. Instead, he walked the neighborhoods on foot. Not in uniform, not in some polished PR stunt, just a plain shirt, sleeves rolled up, shaking hands with store owners, sitting down for coffee in local diners, listening to the fears of ordinary people. Some officers mocked him. What kind of chief plays salesman in the streets? But the citizens noticed. This is the first time a leader talks to us like a human being. Then came his first speech to the entire department. Hundreds of officers packed into the hall. James didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was steady, firm, deliberate. We have allowed crime to speak louder than the people we swore to protect. We've let fear rule this city. As of today, that ends. But I can't do this alone. Either we rise together, or we keep bowing forever. The words hit like a strike of lightning. Some felt ashamed. Others felt provoked, because change always brings resistance. Within weeks, James moved on corruption inside his own house. Quiet investigations led to a list of names of officers on the take. Those who looked the other way, even some directly tied to trafficking rings. When the list went public, the department shook to its core. Suspensions, arrests, officers hauled away from their own desks in handcuffs. It was an earthquake. Citizens cheered. For the first time, they saw justice wasn't just something that targeted criminals in the streets, but also the rot hiding behind a badge. But inside the force, bitterness boiled. Old loyalties had been betrayed. Men who had survived for decades under the old rules now saw James as an enemy. Some pushed back openly. Others worked in shadows. And then the gangs struck back. One night, as James left City Hall, bullets ripped into his car. He survived only because he had changed his route at the last minute. By morning, every newspaper screamed, "Police chief survives assassination attempt." The city buzzed with fear. The question spread like wildfire, will he last? But James didn't flinch. The very next day, he stood before the cameras, calm, in a sharp suit, voice like steel. "You can shoot at my car. You can threaten my life. But you will never scare me. And I promise the people of this city crime will never again be stronger than justice." The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, a wave of hope. But James knew better. Behind the noise, behind the headlines, one truth remained clear. The real war was only beginning, because his enemies weren't just the gangs outside. They were also the men sitting inside his own. Department and court between both. Worlds between bullets from the streets and daggers from within. James would have to prove that sheer willpower could be stronger than all of it. After the failed assassination attempt, the city felt like it was holding its breath. Newspapers splashed photos of Chief James Howard's bullet-riddled car across their front pages. In diners and bars, people whispered in hushed tones. Some called him fearless, a man willing to stand up to the darkness. Others shook their heads and muttered, "Nobody takes on those guys and lives. Howard won't last." Inside City Hall, the tension was worse. Politicians pulled James aside behind closed doors, lowering their voices. "Chief Howard, we respect your courage," one said carefully, "but your family is in danger. If you fail, the entire city's reputation will crumble. Maybe it's time you step down." James rose slowly, eyes steady, voice calm but unyielding. "If I back down now, tomorrow this entire city will live on its knees. I will not allow that." That night, he called a secret meeting, not in the precinct, where informants could be listening, but in an abandoned warehouse by the river, a place that had once been a gang hideout. The building groaned with age, rusted beams rattling in the night wind. A single yellow light bulb casting long shadows across cracked concrete floors. 50 officers stood waiting, the ones who had chosen loyalty over fear, knowing the road ahead might cost them everything. James stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't pound the table. His voice was low, deliberate, every word hitting like a hammer. "We've been living in fear for too long. Citizens are afraid to step outside after dark, and we, the police, have been afraid to confront them. But make no mistake, fear is their greatest weapon. Their real power isn't the guns, it's the terror they plant in our hearts. If we let fear lead us, we're already beaten. To win, we must kill the fear first, and the only weapon strong enough to do that is our will." The warehouse fell silent. The wind howled through broken windows like an answer. A young officer raised his hand, voice trembling. "But sir, they have money, guns, numbers. We're just ordinary men. How can we possibly win?" James fixed his eyes on him, sharp and unwavering. "Exactly. We are ordinary men. And that means we have something they'll never possess: courage. They act out of greed and hate. We act out of justice, out of love for our families, for this community. That's why we will win. And when we do, the entire city will stand with us." A fire caught. Hands clapped together, voices roared, echoing off the warehouse walls. After years of being ground down by fear and failure, these officers felt something awaken again, the pulse of purpose, the heat of belief. James didn't waste time. He rewrote the rules of policing. No more drive-by patrols in squad cars. He ordered his officers to step out, walk the streets, talk to people, play basketball with the kids, help an old woman carry her groceries. At first, residents eyed them with suspicion, but slowly the ice melted. Children started waving instead of running. Mothers started asking for help instead of staying silent. And as trust returned, so did cooperation. Neighbors pointed out drug houses. Anonymous tips poured in about gun deals. Some even volunteered to testify, something unheard of before. Within 3 months, raid after raid toppled gangs. Kingpins were arrested. The crime map, once bleeding red with danger zones, began to turn green with safe spaces. The headlines screamed, "The city is fighting back." The people called James Howard the man who brought back trust. But James knew better. The louder the victory, the harsher the pushback. Sure enough, the remaining gangs formed alliances, spreading rumors, Howard's just a puppet for the politicians. He'll fall soon enough. Inside the department, the traitors still leaked information, still tried to sabotage him from within. One night, James came home to find his front window shattered. On the wall, in dripping red spray paint, were the words, "You're next." His family trembled. His wife's hands shook as she pulled their children close. James wrapped his arms around them, whispering firmly, "They want us scared, but we will not be." At the next warehouse meeting, his voice cut through the cold night like steel. "They will hit back hard. But remember, these bullets can kill a man, but they cannot kill a movement." And that's what we are now. Proof that justice is stronger than fear. The men standing before him were no longer just cops with paychecks. They were warriors with a cause. From that moment on, the battle was no longer just against criminals. It was a war between willpower and fear. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of his small Manhattan apartment, listening to the city's restless heartbeat outside. The distant wail of sirens, the honk of impatient drivers, the soft hum of traffic lights changing colors. New York was alive, as always, but inside Ethan's head, there was only one echo. The real war isn't fought in the streets. It's fought inside the minds of people. Those were Mr. Turner's words, and they refused to leave him alone. He tossed and turned, pulling the thin blanket tighter around his shoulders. The neon sign of the diner across the street blinked on and off, casting red and blue shadows across his walls like a ghostly heartbeat. Each flicker seemed to whisper a question. Who exactly is James Turner? By morning, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He wasn't content just being a student who wrote down wise sayings in a notebook. He wanted to see the man behind the lessons. He wanted to know what Turner had actually lived through, the victories, the scars, the choices that made him the figure everyone whispered about. So he started digging. He spent hours in the public library, hunched over old microfilms and dusty archives. The smell of yellowed paper clung to him, and every click of the machine seemed to pull him deeper into Turner's past. Headline after headline flashed before his eyes. Crime rate in Midtown reaches historic highs. A wave of violence shakes the city. Businesses close. Families flee as fear spreads. Ethan could almost feel the tension of those years pressing out of the ink, a city drowning in chaos. But then the shift came. Violence plummets, community leaders praise new leadership. Midtown residents see hope for the first time in a decade. Turner, the man behind the change. And there it was, over and over again, the name. James Turner. The deeper Ethan looked, the more conflicted the picture became. Some articles painted Turner as a savior, a man who had stared into the abyss of crime and pulled entire neighborhoods back to safety. They described him as tireless, fearless, a leader who went places no one else dared to go. But not all the stories were so kind. Hidden between the lines were rumors, shadows of something unspoken. Critics suggested his methods weren't by the book. Whispers of secret meetings. Alliances that blurred the line between law and lawlessness. Decisions that may have saved lives, but broke every rule in the process. The further Ethan read, the heavier the weight on his chest grew. Was Turner the hero the city needed, or a man who bargained with the devil just to keep the streets quiet? By the end of the week, Ethan couldn't hold it in anymore. He needed to hear the truth from Turner's own mouth. That Friday, they met again in Turner's office. The morning sun poured through the tall glass windows, painting long golden stripes across the polished wooden desk. The city buzzed faintly below, but up here, everything felt suspended in quiet anticipation. Ethan sat across from Turner, trying to steady his voice, though his hands trembled beneath the table. His notebook lay unopened beside him. This wasn't about lessons anymore. "Sir," Ethan began carefully, his throat dry, "I've been reading about your work in Midtown, back when the crime wave hit. Some articles called you a hero, someone who saved entire neighborhoods. But others—" He hesitated, then pushed forward. "Others said you crossed lines, that you made choices people still won't talk about. I need to know what's the truth. Which one is real?" For a long moment, Turner didn't move. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let out a slow breath. The silence stretched, heavy enough that Ethan thought he'd made a mistake. Maybe Turner would end the conversation right here. Maybe some things weren't meant to be spoken. But then, Turner opened his eyes. They weren't the eyes of the polished mentor Ethan had grown used to. These were older, harder, burdened with a history no article could capture. "Both," Turner said quietly. His voice was steady, but there was a rawness in it. "Both are true." The words hit Ethan like a punch. His pulse quickened, and he leaned forward, almost afraid to breathe. Turner had just cracked open a door that had been locked for decades. A door to stories no newspaper had fully told, two choices that had cost more than anyone would ever know. And in that moment, Ethan understood something. This wasn't just about crime rates or leadership strategies. This was about the cost of keeping the peace. Turner looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, Ethan saw not a mentor but a man who carried ghosts, and he knew if he stayed, if he kept asking, he would hear everything. The real story, the kind of story that changes how you see the world. The room was heavy with silence. Only the faint ticking of a war clock broke through. Ethan sat upright, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew Turner had just opened a door, and once Ethan stepped through, there would be no turning back. Turner rested his hands on the desk, tapping slowly with his fingers. His gaze drifted past Ethan, out the tall glass windows where Manhattan glittered in the morning sun. But it was clear he wasn't seeing the city in front of him. His eyes were somewhere else. In another time, another place. "You really want the truth?" Turner asked, his voice low, as if wrestling with himself. Ethan nodded without hesitation. Turner leaned back in his chair, shut his eyes for a moment, and when he spoke again, the calm mentor's voice was gone. What came out was rough, burdened, scarred by memory. New York in the late 80s and early 90s wasn't like the city you know today. You see bright lights now, cafes on every corner, tourists filling the sidewalks. But back then, he let out a bitter laugh. Back then, you could take the wrong turn and walk straight into hell. Ethan swallowed hard, hanging on to every word. Midtown was a battlefield. Gangs controlled entire blocks. Drugs were sold openly under streetlights. Families locked their doors before sundown, not because they wanted rest, but because they weren't sure they'd make it back if they stepped outside. The cops, Turner's jaw tightened. Half of them were powerless. The other half had already taken the bribes and looked the other way. His eyes darkened, his hands pressed into the desk, shoulders trembling slightly with the weight of it. I was just a mid-level officer back then. Nobody trusted me. Nobody thought I could change a damn thing. But I had seen too much. I saw an 8-year-old boy die in his mother's arms because of a stray bullet. I saw bright young men turn into hollow shells, sold out to addiction. And I swore either I would do something, or I'd be buried in that pit right alongside them. Turner paused, exhaling sharply, as if releasing a stone from his chest. Ethan could almost see the ruined city through his words, as though Turner's memory was painting a darker New York on the walls of that quiet office. But to win a war like that, Turner said slowly, you had to play by rules that weren't clean. Ethan furrowed his brow, waiting. Turner's voice dropped. I started meeting the people everyone else feared, the gun runners, the drug lords, the men pulling strings from behind abandoned buildings. I didn't show up as a cop. I showed up as someone willing to deal. I laid down terms. They'd pull back from certain neighborhoods, keep their gunfights out of crowded streets, stop targeting families. In return, I'd look the other way on some of their business elsewhere. It wasn't justice. It was negotiation, a dirty bargain to keep people alive. Ethan's eyes widened. The story was more than he ever imagined. You're saying you worked with criminals? Ethan asked, barely believing the words. Turner met his gaze, head, no flinch, no denial. Yes, I shook hands with the devil, because nobody else was willing to walk into the dark with me. I'm not proud of it. But you have to understand, in a city collapsing under its own weight, sometimes the law is nothing more than paper. And his voice wavered just slightly. I chose the road nobody else wanted to take, just so a few more innocents could survive. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. He didn't know whether to feel betrayed, disappointed, or deeply moved. Turner closed his eyes again. You know what the most terrifying feeling is? It's not when someone points a gun at you. It's when you see the eyes of the people you're protecting. They look at you like a hero, when deep down you know exactly how filthy your hands really are. They call you a savior, but when you lie awake at night, all you see is a traitor to your own ideals. His voice cracked slightly at the edges, like an old wound tearing open again. Ethan sat frozen, his blood running hot. This wasn't a simple moral lesson anymore. This was brutal truth about the choices a man makes when every option leads to pain. He whispered, almost afraid, and what was the result? Turner opened his eyes, fixing Ethan with a gaze that carried decades of weight. The result was crime dropping off a cliff. Families stayed. Children played ball in the streets again without fear of gunfire. But it also meant I owed debts. Debts to the souls that paid the price for those dirty bargains. And that weight, Ethan, he touched his chest, that weight never leaves you. Ethan couldn't move. His heart hammered, his mind spinning. From this moment on, he knew he was inside Turner's world, now a world, not of black and white, but of endless grey, where every choice carved scars into the man who made it. Turner leaned back, eyes fixed on the glaring light outside the window. So, do you still want to hear the rest? Ethan nodded, firm, without hesitation, and Turner began to tell him about the nights he walked the thin line between life and death, about the handshakes in the shadows, and about the one moment that changed him forever. For the next several weeks, Riverdale felt like a town learning how to breathe again. The streets, once scarred by gunfire and sirens, began to look almost ordinary. Early mornings brought the smell of fresh coffee drifting out of small cafes that had reopened after years of shuttered doors. Mothers pushed strollers along sidewalks without glancing over their shoulders. Children pedaled their bikes in wide circles, laughing freely in places where fear had once held them hostage. On the surface, it looked like a miracle had taken root, but Daniel knew better. He understood that peace was not just the absence of violence. It was a fragile thing, as delicate as glass. One careless crack and everything could shatter. The gangs might have scattered, their leaders locked away, but the roots of desperation still ran deep. Poverty, broken families, hopelessness, those shadows didn't vanish overnight. And Daniel could feel them, hiding in the corners of Riverdale, waiting for the wrong moment to surface. One night, after a long shift, Daniel was driving home when he noticed a group of teenagers on a worn-down basketball court under a flickering streetlight. They weren't causing trouble, just passing the ball, talking loud, pretending to be tougher than they really were. But something in their faces made Daniel's chest tighten. Beneath the bravado, he saw uncertainty, a hunger to belong, a need for direction. And Daniel knew better than anyone that hunger could be twisted. All it would take was the return of the wrong voice, whispering promises of power, money, or respect. Those boys could be lost in an instant. The image haunted him. He couldn't shake it, even after pulling into his driveway, even after sitting at the edge of his bed, staring into the dark. By morning, his decision was made. At the precinct, Daniel gathered his officers. The room was filled with men and women who had spent months grinding through sleepless nights, long patrols, and dangerous standoffs. They expected strategy updates, crime reports, maybe another raid. Instead, Daniel stood at the front, silent for a moment, and then spoke with a weight in his voice they had rarely heard before. We've been doing our jobs reacting to violence, chasing down criminals, putting out fires as they come. But if all we ever do is react, we'll never get ahead. We'll always be one step behind. We need to stop waiting for trouble. We need to start shaping the future before someone else does. The words landed heavy. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One veteran leaned back, arms crossed, and muttered, "We're cops, Daniel, not social workers." Another added, "Our job is to enforce the law, not babysit kids." Daniel didn't flinch. He met their eyes, steady and unwavering. Enforcing the law is only half the battle. You know it, I know it. If we want to keep this town safe, not just for a month, not just for a year, but for the next generation, then we need to make sure fewer kids ever turn to crime in the first place. We can't just lock up the problem. We have to cut it off at the root. Silence stretched across the room. Some frowned. Others stared at the floor, lost in thought. But Daniel pressed on. He spoke of mentorship programs, of working with schools, of building safe spaces where teenagers could learn, play, and grow without falling into the traps waiting on the streets. At first, resistance was strong. Officers felt overwhelmed enough already. The idea of spending their time coaching basketball or attending school assemblies felt foreign. But slowly, Daniel's conviction began to sink in. They remembered their own childhoods, their own mentors, and the people who had steered them away from bad decisions. And one by one, heads began to nod. Soon, the plan took shape. Local businesses offered sponsorship for youth leagues. Retired teachers volunteered to tutor struggling students after school. Churches opened their halls for evening programs. Parents, who had once kept silent out of fear, stepped forward to help. Rivendell, scarred and battered though it was, began to believe in itself again. And yet, Daniel couldn't ignore the shadow creeping at the edges. Whispers spread that old gang leaders were regrouping outside town. Word on the street was, They were biding their time, watching, waiting for the right chance to slip back in. Daniel knew the truth. Stopping violence was never the hardest part. The real battle was keeping it from returning. And this time, the fight would test not just his badge, but the very soul of the community he had sworn to protect. For a while, Riverdale seemed to be living under a fragile calm. The community programs were working. Kids were laughing again on the playgrounds. Families were opening up their front doors without hesitation. Streets that had once been owned by fear now carried the smell of fresh bread from bakeries and the rhythm of normal life. But Daniel knew better. He knew this peace was thin like paint covering a cracked wall. Underneath, the fractures remained. And then the whispers started. It began quietly, in the outskirts of town. Familiar faces spotted in dark bars, in abandoned warehouses, in parking lots where no one dared linger. Old names resurfaced in murmurs. Men who had once run Riverdale's underworld were gathering again, testing the air, waiting for the right moment. People said it softly, almost afraid the words themselves would bring danger back. They're here again. Daniel got his first official report from a rookie officer, nervous but sure. Some of the teenagers from the community basketball program had stopped showing up. No calls, no explanations, they just vanished. A few days later, fresh tattoos began appearing on the corners, inked symbols everyone in town recognized. It was a signature, a taunt. The gangs weren't hiding anymore. They were back, and at the center of it all was a name Daniel thought he might never have to hear again: Marcus Kane. Kane had once been the undisputed king of Riverdale's streets, a man whose reputation bled fear into every neighborhood. Years ago, Daniel himself had led the operation that brought him down. He remembered the night vividly, the raid, the handcuffs, the look in Kane's eyes that promised this isn't over. Kane was locked away, and Riverdale took its first step toward freedom. But now, because of a legal loophole, Kane had walked out of prison early, and he had returned with the same cold smile, the same venomous charisma, as if no time had passed at all. The first time Daniel saw him again, it was by accident. Daniel was driving through a neighborhood that had once been a battlefield when he noticed a crowd gathered near a corner store. Music pounded from tinted cars, their headlights cutting through the dark. Young men postured on the sidewalk, laughing too loud, daring the world to challenge them. And then Daniel saw him. Marcus Kane. The man hadn't aged a day in spirit. His presence filled the block like a shadow stretching over the pavement. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to wave a gun. Just being there was enough to pull gravity toward him. Daniel's stomach turned. He knew what was happening. Kane was recruiting again. Not with threats, not yet, but with promises. Kane was a master at sniffing out weakness, at finding kids who felt invisible and whispering the words they were desperate to hear. Follow me, and you'll never go hungry. Stick with me, and no one will ever disrespect you again. With me, you'll matter. Daniel clenched the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. Anger burned through him, but so did something heavier: fear. Not fear of Kane himself, but fear of what Kane represented. If Kane succeeded in planting his flag back in Riverdale, if people began to believe that his shadow was stronger than the light of law and order, then everything Daniel and his team had built would crumble overnight. That night, Daniel called an emergency meeting at the precinct. The room was filled with his officers, men and women who had sweated, bled, and sacrificed beside him during Riverdale's darkest days. Daniel stood at the front, his voice low but fierce. "We're at a crossroads," he told them. "Marcus Kane is back. If he reclaims this town, then every inch of progress we've made, every ounce of trust we've earned, will vanish. This is not just about stopping crime, it's about protecting hope. And this time, we can't rely only on badges and handcuffs. We need to prove to this town that justice doesn't sleep." The room fell silent. The weight of his words pressed on every officer there. They understood this wasn't just another operation. This wasn't just about making arrests. It was about fighting for the soul of Rivendell. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, staring out at the streets cloaked in darkness. His mind replayed the faces of the teenagers he had seen on that basketball court weeks before, their laughter, their fragile innocence. He thought of the families who had only just begun to step outside without fear, and he thought of Marcus Kane, waiting in the shadows, ready to snatch it all away. Doubt gnawed at him. Could he really hold the line against someone like Kane? Could the fragile hope of Riverdale withstand the weight of that returning darkness? But then Daniel remembered something stronger than fear. He remembered the spark in a young boy's eyes when he hit his first three-pointer on the community court. He remembered a mother's voice, breaking with gratitude, as she thanked him for giving her children their neighborhood back. He remembered the small victories that had made Riverdale believe again. And in that silence, Daniel knew his answer. He could not turn back. He would not surrender. Riverdale had come too far to fall again. And if Marcus Kane wanted a war, Daniel was ready to walk straight into the storm. Riverdale was no longer the peaceful town it seemed just months ago. Ever since Marcus Kane returned, darkness had begun to seep back into the corners of the city. By day, everything looked normal. Cafes stayed open. Neighbors waved at each other. Kids pedaled their bikes down the sidewalks. But when the sun went down, the atmosphere shifted. Streetlights flickered. Unfamiliar cars rolled through, blasting heavy bass. And wary glances replaced casual smiles. One Friday night, Daniel was on duty when the call came, inurgent, panicked. A brawl had erupted in the East Market district, a neighborhood once ruled by gangs. He and his tactical team sped through the streets, sirens cutting the night. When they arrived, the scene felt like a flashback from darker times. Several storefronts were smashed in, shards of glass glittered on the asphalt, and two young men lay bleeding after a knife fight. Around them, a nervous crowd watched in silence, too afraid to step closer. But what broke Daniel's heart was seeing familiar faces among the chaos. Two boys he had once coached in the community basketball program now wore black jackets, the fresh ink of a gang tattoo visible on their arms. Kane's influence had reached them. Daniel clenched his fists, anger and sorrow colliding inside him by morning. The headlines were everywhere. Violence returns to Riverdale. Social media lit up with photos of shattered windows, police cruisers and stretchers in the street. Fear spread faster than the facts, and the fragile trust Daniel had worked so hard to build was slipping away. The next day, in an emergency meeting, Daniel faced his officers. His voice was steady but heavy. "We're at a turning point," he said. "Kane doesn't just want control of these streets. He wants to steal this town's heart. If people start believing he's stronger than we are, then everything we've built, every ounce of progress will vanish." A young officer spoke up, uncertainty in his voice. "But sir, he's got the numbers. He's got money, networks. Do we really have enough to stop him?" Daniel's gaze hardened. "We have something Kane will never understand. We have the community, and that's our greatest weapon." He unveiled a bold plan, not just more patrols, not just crackdowns, but true partnership with the townspeople. He organized a town hall that very night, urging families, business owners, teachers, anyone who cared about Riverdale to come. When Daniel stood at the podium and told the truth that Marcus Kane was back, and that the fight for Riverdale's future had begun, the hall fell silent. People looked down, scared, uncertain. For a moment, Daniel feared he had asked too much of them. Then, slowly, an elderly shopkeeper stood. His voice trembled, but his words cut through the silence. If you officers are willing to stand up, then we can't hide anymore. This is our town, not his. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then rising until the whole room was on its feet. They weren't soldiers, but they were ready to take a stand. That night, as Daniel drove alone through the center of Riverdale, his thoughts raced. He knew Kane wouldn't sit quietly while he rallied the people. A storm was coming, and when it hit, it would be brutal. But for the first time, Daniel didn't feel alone. Behind him stood loyal officers, yes, but also parents, teachers, business owners, and children who deserved a future free of fear. Riverdale was about to enter a new battle. Not just one fought with guns and handcuffs, but with willpower, faith, and the strength of a community refusing to be broken. And Daniel whispered to himself as the night pressed in, Kane can spread fear, but we will fight back with hope. Night fell over Riverdale like a heavy curtain. The wind swept through narrow streets, carrying the smell of exhaust, burning trash, and a thick tension that pressed down on everyone. People stayed quiet behind their windows, knowing tonight would be different. Tonight would decide everything. At the end of Main Street, a flickering street lamp cast its weak light over cracked pavement. Daniel stood there, body tense inside his bulletproof vest, his radio spitting out rapid updates from his team. But in his heart, there was silence. This wasn't just another raid. This was the moment that would determine Riverdale's future. And then he appeared. Marcus Kane. He stepped out of a battered black car, no longer sharp and polished, but worn down and vicious. His face carried the harsh lines of a man clinging to fading power. He smirked, his voice splitting the night. Daniel, you're still living in a fantasy. People don't follow hope, they follow fear. And fear is mine to command. Daniel inhaled slowly, his eyes locked on Kane's. His voice was steady. Iron in the dark. No, Kane. Fear might make people bow, but only for a while. Hope makes them stand tall. And tonight, I'm not standing here alone. As if on cue, shadows stirred. Not just Daniel's officers, but the townspeople themselves. Doors swung open. Porch lights spilled onto the street. A mother clutching her child. The old shopkeeper with a wooden bat in his hands. Neighbors who had hidden for years now stepped out, forming a walnut of weapons, but of courage. Chaos erupted. Kane's men charged forward, wild and desperate. But this time, Riverdale did not run. Shouts, footsteps, metal clashing echoed through the block. Officers fought back, citizens blocked alleys, phones lit up with calls for help. A tidal wave of resistance rose, no longer crushed by fear. Kane roared, scrambling to hold on to the last shred of control. He lunged at Daniel, and they crashed to the cold asphalt. Punches, gritted teeth, the raw struggle of two men fighting not just for themselves, but for what they believed ruled the world, fear or hope. With a final surge, Daniel flipped him over. Click. The cuffs snapped shut around Kane's wrists. His body collapsed to the ground, breath ragged and broken, silence. The whole street froze. Daniel looked round into the eyes of the people. A child clutching his mother's hand, an old man standing upright for the first time in years. And then, from the stillness, came applause, hesitant at first, then swelling into cheers that shook the street. Riverdale had just witnessed its freedom. Daniel rose, drenched in sweat, chest heaving. But what filled him wasn't the pride of a personal victory, it was the rebirth of an entire community. Cain, bound and powerless, was no longer the shadow that had ruled Rivendell that night. The town learned they would never again live under fear. They had chosen trust. They had chosen hope. And once people stand together, no darkness can hold them forever. This story isn't just about Daniel and Cain. It's about a universal truth. Fear may dominate for a moment, but hope endures. Real strength doesn't come from making others afraid, comes from lighting the spark that makes them rise. A community becomes powerful only when its people believe they can change their world. Riverdale proved this. They didn't just win back a single night, they won back their future. Because when people choose hope over fear, they don't just survive, they triumph forever.